Hey there, it's Mike, Modern Retro Dev. Today I'd like to talk to you about the rabbit hole that eventually led me to modern retro computing. Stay tuned. So today I wanted to give you guys a little bit of background as to how I ended up into modern retro computers and developing for them. Um, Myself, I have about 20 years of experience writing code, and this is predominantly originally for fun, and now I do it for work as well. But what I do for work and what I do for fun, 100% different. And it probably wasn't until about 4 to 6 years ago that I started getting really interested in doing game development. And it's hard for me to pinpoint exactly really when that started, but I can say that when I first started, like really dipping my toes into it was after stumbling across a YouTuber channel called GD Quest that was specifically dedicated towards like getting people started in game development. They had some pretty cool tutorial series. And that will lead me to talking about the first game engine thing that I started playing around with. So first off, I'd like to talk about the Godot game engine. It's a free open source game engine. It's cross-platform. It's pretty great. It can make some really, I'd say almost AAA games, maybe even AAA. I mean, they're definitely kind of growing that way. Here's a bunch of games that have been published with it. Some of them are pretty awesome. I haven't played most of them, but I will show you my favorite game of the bunch, which is Dome Keeper. This game, it's kind of you go down into the mines with one of different types of characters, and you mine for minerals, and then you can use those minerals to upgrade your character's ability to mine or their speed, or there's different gadgets and things you can get. You can use it to upgrade defenses on the dome and other sorts of things. And so the game alternates play phases between going down and mining for things, and periodically aliens will show up and attack your base, and you have to defend your dome. So here's a little baby attack. I mean, it gets pretty intense by the end of the game, but early on it's pretty simple. Anyhow, I made a prototype game with this. I mean, I made a few games as I was learning how to use it, and this was a prototype game I made. It's a little platformer, and it's pretty buggy, so I'm not going to show a lot of gameplay, but I do want to give an example of what it looks like here. So not too long after I got my game prototype to the point I showed just a moment ago, I came across the opportunity to come up with a typing tutor game for a bunch of kids that didn't yet know how to type. And I think it was a pretty novel idea that I had, and naturally you would think the best tool for the job is the one you know how to use. I mean, that's kind of naive programmer mentality, but like that's often what happens. So I went ahead and took Godot and I just started like working on this thing. And I have to admit, like development, it went at a snail's pace. It was completely glacial. And I very quickly decided I was probably going to get nowhere with this. But I remembered something I had heard a few years earlier about this concept of the virtual computer, virtual console, or fantasy console, fantasy computer. And I gotta admit, like the first time I heard this idea, I thought it was like the worst idea ever. Why would you make up a new computer, a new console that doesn't exist when there already exist old consoles? However, after reading up about it a little bit, it wasn't so much doing this because they were unsatisfied with the old consoles. It was more about taking the retro aesthetic and making it more accessible on a modern system. And it's one of those circumstances where like less is more. For example, like it's easier to write a poem than it is to write like a Moby Dick style story. you can still convey like something complex to, your reader, but it takes a lot less time and a lot less effort, kind of like distilling it down to the smallest parts. And, by that same virtue, it's a lot easier to pick the right color if you have a palette of 16 colors versus if you have 16 million colors. So it was an easier way to like prototype. So anyway, that leads me to talking or showing you the second thing that I got myself into. Next up, I'd like to talk about TIC-80. This is my fantasy console of choice. This is the thing that I started doing my prototype of the typing tutor game with, and I found that by switching over to this unfamiliar system with an unfamiliar programming language, the fact that it was so cut down, I was still able to flush out my prototype an order of magnitude faster than I was with Godot, that I was much more familiar with at that point. It had been something like several months of experience working with Godot, and switching over to TIC-80, like, it was just fast. So it's, as you can see here, it's kind of an interesting, it's supposed to be kind of like a Commodore 64 type thing, albeit a little more fancy. The native language that it used to work with was, oh gosh, I'm blanking on me, Lua. But in recent developments, you can now use Python and some other things. Most of my earlier developments were done in Lua because it was predating them adding support for Python. But it's got a cool command line interface, and then it's also got this thing called Surf, which allows you to a nice way to navigate through things that you've developed, or in this case, as I'm doing here, going online to play games made by other people. So my favorite game for TIC-80 is this one here, Balmung. It's kind of Zelda-ish kind of game. I'm not going to include any of the music here because it's not mine, but I do think it is fantastic chiptune music. If you get a chance, check it out. You could get the game completely for free, or maybe even play it in your browser if you're really on the fence. But it's got kind of interesting mechanics to it. You have sort of a stamina bar. Swinging your sword uses stamina. Blocking attacks uses stamina. So it's similar to other things, but it is different. I find it very compelling. They do some interesting stuff. TIC-80 as a whole limits you to 64K for the space used by the actual game. And then there's also an additional limitation of 16 colors. And so they are doing these cool effects going between daytime and nighttime by, doing a bunch of pokes into memory and actually changing the palette as the game executes. It's all really very neat, and I'm super impressed that they were able to fit this in 64K. So get a chance, play it. There's definitely some more interesting games that you can look at for the system, but if I had to point at one that's like something you've absolutely got to see, like, this is it. So another cool thing about TIC-80 is you can just like pop into the code editor for any of these games. And so it's interesting to play the game and appreciate what other people have done, but then you might be wondering to yourself, well, how did they do that? So here you can like peek underneath the surface and you can see like, how did they lay out the tile maps? How did they actually construct the code? How did they do the music like this? So it's just as good a learning aid as it is sort of something for prototyping. So let me go ahead and show my biggest prototype I made with this game that I was kind of making for a couple of my kids. They're really big into sea disasters, so I wanted to make a Titanic themed game where you sail around and avoid icebergs, and there is a 2-player mode. I don't demo it here, but player 2 can sail the Lusitania, and like any good 2-player game, there's the potential for friendly fire, so you can collide with each other and I think that's fun, being able to Grinch your other person you're playing with. I think adds a lot of fun to it. So the life on here is bulkheads because in if I remember the story correctly, the Titanic could have 4 sunken flooded bulkheads and it would stay afloat, but if 5 are sunk, the ship would go down. So seems natural that should be a life bar. Another fun aspect to this game is it alternates between nighttime and daytime levels. So far, we've only seen a daytime level, but as the little daytime progression bar on the left goes by, we'll be switching over to level 2, which is a nighttime level. These are appreciably harder because, obviously your visual radius is greatly reduced. And there's actually a lot more stuff that I have slated to go into this game than just that, but basically I kind of ran into some limitations. I do like this prototype, but first off, it's kind of like, well, I want to see this run on actual hardware. This fantasy console is cool, but like, it's not the same thing as seeing it actually run on real hardware. So I did some looking and dreamed about being able to run my games, my prototypes on real hardware. And the closest thing that I could find as a manifestation of like what TIC80 would be if it were an actual device was this thing called the U console made by company Clockwork Pi. I'm not gonna like do a deep dive on it right now, but like this is TIC80 here running, and if I wanted, I could start up my prototype game that I was writing. Um, so it did kind of exist, but there was a lot of issues with this device. For one thing, it's kind of unobtainium. Like if you look online, it's always back ordered. It's never in. It's a little slow to get. And then there's so many different configurations you can get on it. It's kind of hard to tell like what's the actual performance of this device. And at least in the case of TIC80, it kind of seemed like it would run at different speeds if you were running it on a computer versus a laptop versus, this device here, which makes it really hard to target. Like, what are you actually writing for? Because what I really want is to write a thing and know that it's going to perform well, like everywhere that you play it. And so it's kind of like what I really wanted was an official, actual hardware specification as opposed to an idea, like an amalgamation of specifications. And so the longer I thought about that, it's like, well, what would be similar to this? And this is about the time, well, I guess another thing I could say is like, I thought this was a very interesting concept, and the idea of poking values into memory to change the palette was really alien, but very interesting. So I read up about like what inspired this fantasy console, and it was basically the Commodore 64 for, as far as I could tell. And I was like, what is this Commodore 64 thing? And that caused me to start, checking out a bunch of different YouTubers, and eventually I came across the Commander X16 project. I was like, oh wow, this is kind of like what I'm looking for here. This is that retro aesthetic. This is that retro computer, but with a dash of like modern convenience and like a little bit more, but it's still a hard specification. And I kind of made up my mind and said, like, okay, if I can write stuff for one of these modern retro systems, like, we're gonna go ahead and say like that qualifies, that checks the box of having, accomplished that bucket list item. So anyhow, that's really what I wanted to cover in this video. And that leads me on to the next thing, which is what I'm going to talk about next time. My plan right now is to talk about the 3 projects that I'm currently working on. These are actual modern retro projects. It's not going to be backstory stuff um, next time. So hopefully you guys will find what I'm working on right now be interesting. And I guess that's my cue to get back to some modern retro dev.